Hi everyone, James here from F9 and welcome to the Logic Pro demonstration for our F9 Classic Club Keys and Synths release. Now, we wanted to basically bottle the sound of 90s clubbing with Origins, and nearly 18 months later, we finally completed the trilogy of releases. So today, we're going to use just a small selection of the 333 patches that come in the 11GB Classic Club Keys and Synths release, as well as some of the other releases from the Origins range to make a track from start to finish. Now, this video will be heavily edited to just give you the choicest bites, and we will show you just how powerful all of these Origins releases are when used together. Let's dive straight in. So this is what we're going to be eventually working towards. Let me give you a couple of quick blasts. And later on, it's going to do this. Love those big 7th chords at the moment. It is summer after all, although to be honest, I wrote this whilst it was summer outside, and now being England, it's absolutely pissing it down with rain. Never a dull moment by the English seaside. Now, everything that you've just heard in that piece has been made from the F9 Origins releases. That's the Origins Beats, the Bass Collection, and the brand new Keys and Synths. But let's just back up a minute and go right back to the beginning. Okay, so first of all, I want to select one of the Origins Beats pages, and I'm inside the master folder of Origins Beats. I've got audio demos up here, which are just very simple little bounces of the whole thing, and this is the one I want to use. It's called Swing State, 122 BPM, and it sounds like this. Quite a lot of the sounds in that beat were created with an SP1200, and you can really hear that crunch in there. So let's open the Logic page and get cracking. So here we go, and the stems are already set up in Logic. Now, bear in mind, this is one of 24 different stem sets within the Beats collection. And as well as that main beat, we've got a nice little breakdown section here. Sounding great, so I'm just going to start moving things around and start some basic arrangements. Now, one thing I will do is just create a separate little channel for the kick drum, and we'll do some tricks where we just take all of the sub out just for a bar or so. Great little turnaround points. Now, it may seem strange to be arranging drums as an actual first step, but trust me, it works like a treat, because if you've got a great set of drums and you're actually starting to program, then you don't actually have to stop your creative flow. And the most important thing I always find at the beginning is to get all of the ideas down as quick as possible. Okay, so we're just digging in halfway through the arrangement process, and you can see I'm already starting to put breakdowns in. And one of the great things about working like this is once you actually start to build different sections in, even just with drums, then you can never get stuck in an 8-bar loop, because there's always something before and after the section that you're working on to act as inspiration. And here we go, the basics of a track already. We haven't even put a single musical note on there. Now, one thing I do want to add are some of the sound menus and the kits that come with the beat collection, so we can program a little bit over the top of this, particularly with some 909 snare rolls. So I'm just going to go up to the user patches in Logic's library. I've got the beats collection installed. We'll take what we got. Let's take the tight one. Actually, 909 days. And maybe one more. We'll come back to that. We'll grab a couple of other bits and pieces. The effects hits are always good fun. So here's the first 909 kit. That's actually been sampled in Round Robin. And what people don't really always understand with a 909, and particularly an 808, is that a lot of the voice circuitry is actually an analog synthesizer. And particularly the sounds like the claps and the snares, that are made from white noise, the only way to truly replicate some of the soul of the machine is to sample the actual drum sounds in round robin, which is what we've done here. And I've just got a sound menu here of some effects hits. They'll really come in hand later on as we start to build this track up. So just on one of the main sections here, I've started writing a bass line in. One of the things I love about this pack since we made it is once you've actually got a bass line in place like this, you can then skip through some of the other patches within the user library and see what they sound like against your track. So that's how quickly it can load on a modern computer. Now there's an SSD in this machine, but it is not new. It's a 2010 Silver Tower. So it just shows you how quick and efficient Logic is at actually loading these things backwards and forwards. So you can pretty much always just test different bass sounds from the bass packs. Now the only other thing I've added to it is a compressor that's actually just firing off a sidechain kick at the top. So I've got a very basic loop of a kick drum out there. It's 3 bars for some reason, not sure why. Must have been having a funny 5 minutes. And I've actually taken it off the mix bus by coming down to the output of that particular channel and just selecting no output. That means you don't get an extra kick, obviously, whilst you're working. But it does mean that you can pick it up and compress things against it. And I find this original Logic compressor to be the actual fastest to respond and the best when actually running sidechains. Have a look at the settings if you need to. I've pretty much got the attack down to 0 and the release is fairly short as well. Quite a low ratio and it's just tickling. So it's doing about 4 dB of gain reduction. And I'm going to repeat the same trick that we used on the kick with bass parts as well. So in this cutout section, so I basically duplicate the entire channel. I'm just going to remove all of the sub, keep that Q level under control so it doesn't bloom around the actual cut-off point. You'll see what I mean now as we come out of this. So we're just always looking to add additional impact points with little tricks like that. Okay, so I've just added a little bass turnaround that's in these lighter coloured bass parts. Little variations like that will just add little pockets of interest across the track. Okay, now for the keyboard sounds. So I've got this fab organ sound playing along. I've actually done a lot of filtering with the macro controls here. It normally sounds like this. It's just adding a little extra highlight to our groove section. So now I know the bass line's working against the drums, I want to jump into the breakdown in the middle and create the main section, which is the piano drop. So I'm in the F9 Origins Keys and Synths folder in the piano subfolder, and I've selected 1994 piano. And this is the main piano part. Now I've got a nice little trick here that I'm actually inferring a melody with the top line of this piano. So if you can get a piano part that has a kind of single note melody like that, it will be more memorable. And here's why. The human brain on average is monophonic. It can only remember one note at once. So when someone's humming back your actual piano part, if it's got a kind of leading melody to it, it's much easier to remember. And of course, our static bass line isn't going to work with that piano part. So I've created another little bass line that is going to follow these piano chords. I've actually created a separate piano channel for this section, and that's simply because when the drums and the bass come in, I want to roll actually quite a lot of the actual sub and bass information off to make way for the kick drum and the bass line. If I were to leave it open, it might all be too much on the bottom end. And of course, having the processing of the piano split between the different sections means that you can do things like I am here, which is just tickling it with a softer sidechain compressor. If you want a softer sidechaining effect, use the Studio VCA. Okay, now I'm just starting to flesh this actual section out now, and I've added another bass layer. As you can see, I've taken quite a lot off the bottom. And to make sure the piano's cutting through, I've got a little bit of a piano trick here. I've taken another piano sound that's quite sharp. And shorten the envelope and put some nice reverb on it, just so that it can add a little bit of bite to that front piano section. Now, if I open this back out, you'll probably recognize the piano sound. But adding that additional patch from the Keys and Synths collection will just allow us to bring that piano forward when we need to. Now, if I play through an 8-bar section and mute that new part on the actual front of it, you'll hear what a difference it makes when it comes in. And there, I'm sure you can hear those additional wavefronts that will just help us to cut this through once the actual drums are in. Okay, now let's go to the front of the breakdown, and I got this fantastic string patch from an old 8-bit sampler called an N-Sonic Mirage. When we were sampling some of these old 8-bit patches for the Key and Synth collection, we actually used an Oberheim DPX-1. It can read multiple vintage sampler discs, including old Emulator 2 discs, but it's got slightly better output converters, but still those fat analog filters that were in use at the time. And it became a perfect tool for us. Now, its first use in this breakdown is just low notes anchoring the actual chord sequence. And you hear there's a little flick just on the last bar of the main turnarounds. And that goes along with the piano part. So tiny little extra bits of movement like that on fairly static parts, particularly at the end of sections or the ends of bars, can really help add interest and atmosphere. Now, I've also got another track with the same patch on, and I've created a nice little single note melody that's in the style, I suppose, of Strings of Life. And the low bit nature of this patch really helps things like that cut through in a busy mix. And of course, it's almost part of our collective psyche. Over the years, we've heard those sounds used tons of times in house records. Also, it's incredibly simple, but it's dancing around the notes of the chords really nicely with an additional little pickup at the end. Okay, starting to add more layers now, and I've put a single note high string line from a patch called Alias Strings from the Key and Synth collection just across the top of the breakdown and other parts of the beats. And I know from experience, having done it countless times, that when you have a high line like that, nicely coated in reverb, and it goes onto a big club system, you've still got this top end energy whilst the breakdown happens. It can be an ace moment in a club. I've also added an extra layer to our melody strings for the main section. So we've got this patch. The layering of those two is really starting to add weight to that actual melody. The last thing I've done is just repeated some of the piano chords at the end so we can do a nice rise into another style of breakdown later on. So always a great arrangement trick. Just see if you can get a section where you can loop part of your chord sequence. Sometimes it's complicated because the chords are lying across bars, but with a nice bit of careful editing, you'll be able to get there. And it's almost like creating your own samples effectively. Almost forgot, I've actually added an organ patch to the main piano part as well. This is called New Jersey Organ from the Keys Synths collection. And it's a nice, simple organ sound. Some of them are really complex that we've got in there, but this one just works beautifully underneath piano. And often what you're trying to do is just add little extra frequency points and fattening layers, and that particular patch works a treat. If you've made it this far into the video, thanks so much for watching. I think it's time for an Easter egg. This is a 30% off coupon for F9 audio. It's one use per customer, but it won't run out on you, so you can use it whenever you want in the next few years. So now I want to take a look at this kind of second breakdown coming out of those repeated piano chord sections. This is what I've built so far. Nicely atmospheric, and it's got a big riser coming out of that section where it's all going to kick back in again. Let me break down what I've done here. For the main chordal beds, I've used two string patches from the Keys Synths collection. Got this one called Classic JX Strings. And that's layered with a more realistic patch called Go Strings. And it's all underpinned with a nice big analog patch from a Sequential Pro 1. You may have heard a big riser come out of those strings, and that's from this patch called Hoover Dam. And yes, that is the classic Hoover sound from the Alpha Juno 2. But what we've actually done here is I've changed the pitch bend control so that it goes up a couple of octaves. And I've just drawn in a nice little pitch bend rise. Let me just find it. But then we can just use a static held note as our riser. And because we have pitch control, we can make sure it ends on the right root or the right note for this track, which is an E. Remember those 909 kits we added earlier? I've had them hidden whilst we've just been working on the melodic parts, but now I'm going to use them to bring some more additional interest to this breakdown. I've got this clap part over the top of some rides. Just a very simple one-note rim hit. But together they add quite a nice bit of interest. And of course, you've got to have some 909 snare fills, and I've got a lovely set here. Bearing in mind these are round robin sampled, so that you get this kind of soul that comes from the original 909, where every single drum hit is just minutely different. Just to add some punctuation points to some of the downbeat moments, I've got the effects hits menu from the F9 Origins Beats collection. And they're just being used to mark the downbeat. Now that breakdown's working well, I'm going to go back to the front of the track and start arranging there. And I've got a very traditional way to introduce the bass. All I've done is just filter off all of the subs and some of the bass from that actual bass part. So it introduces the melody, but it doesn't have its full effect until the actual kick drum comes in, and then you get that enormous slam. Now, you may have heard an additional couple of sounds in there. Both of these are from the Keys Synths collection. The first is this stereo patch that's controlled by the modulation wheel of Juno White Noise. And that's just rising up with a live recorded sweep of a modulation wheel. I've also added one of my favourite sounds across this entire pack, a recording of a North American loon. This sound is popping up everywhere, even on Behringer videos at the moment, and it was in a couple of key tracks because it existed on a very old sampler disc that we've actually recorded along with this. And with everything that we've discussed so far, I've also created this mini breakdown in the middle of the main groove section. Now looking further at this intro section, and I've added a few little riffs from this great sound called French Kissing. And I've added slightly more swing than I might normally do. In fact, actually more than the bass part, but it seems to work with this. Sometimes using different swing values for different actual musical parts will work really well. And later on, I'm going to bring another sound in called Funk Wire. It's this really sharp sound that you're just about to hear. I actually nearly didn't include this in the pack, but when I started to come towards putting the demos together, I suddenly realised that sounds like this can be a brilliant little flavour compared to all of the other things that are in there. Now, just building up towards that main breakdown, I've also added a fat little Juno part. And you'll see these are all simple. They're actually no more than 1 or 2 notes at a time, but they're all just adding towards this groove. Now, I've got some serious number crunching to do when I actually come to balance and mix this. Each of that part has its own little unique sonic space, but also its own little unique rhythmic space, which is why they can all work together. I've also added some parts to that second breakdown. I find it's quite good fun to fly in between the 2 different sections in tracks like this because it keeps the kind of interest up. If you just work on one section, you can go quite insane. Now, I'm just going to turn an arpeggiator off here, and I've got this sound from the Keys and Synth pack called Xylo. But it's great for little sequences, little fast sequences. So if I just put the arp on. And yet again, that's sourced from one of the early digitals. I think that may be the ESQ80, not 100% sure. But it's doing this over the breakdown. And it's joined by one note of a pizzicato sound. And we all know where this is from. As you can also see here, I've duplicated the parts onto separate channels so that I can process them slightly separately when the beats are in, and in this case adding some side chaining. Okay, now as you can see, I've added quite a few more bits and we're really starting to get here with this now. Let me go through the new parts one by one. I've got this stab, it's called DC Stab from the Keys and Synth pack. And I've added an extra tape delay on that with a great big long feedback chain just to give it some real atmosphere so it spreads right out as it hits. And I've also added a Detroit style stab. And I just quickly want to show you the huge collection of stabs that we've got in here. A lot of these were recorded with a vintage Akai sampler. It's one of Akai's first sampler called an S612, and it was a 12-bit sampler with some real-time controls on the front. It was very basic, and it could only really hold one sound at a time. But it's got a massively thick, solid sound to it, and that's how we've actually managed to achieve the authenticity of a lot of the stabs in this pack. So here's that sound in action. And now coming into this mini breakdown where the beats are, or this main groove section is, I wanted to add a melodic top line. And it's very simple. It starts on the root of the key E and then just follows a little pattern down. And that's being done with this main lead sound. And it's also being doubled by our strings that we use in the breakdown later on. And we're also going to join it up later on with this amazing organ patch. And that's just going to be helping out the piano chords. Now, I've pretty much got all the parts in, but you'll see I've actually muted an awful lot of them here, and that's because I want to get a nice static balance going. That's a balance where nothing's automated, and you're just basically setting levels, giving yourself a nice amount of headroom. And I'm doing this particularly on this section that I'm really concentrating on because the pianos and the strings are in there with just the bass. Everything else around it is muted so that there's no fluff. I can just concentrate on getting these core sounds leveled correctly. And also make sure that the bass has plenty of punch in the first groove section. And what's important here, I've not really changed anything. I might have added a touch more EQ onto the kick. This is all just being done with level, so it shows you the power that a decent balance can create. Okay, so my static balance is done. It's sounding really good. I've just added a little touch of limiter onto the master chain. That's just so I can see what mastering processing is actually going to do to the balance. It's always a good tip when you're kind of about 75% of the way or 80% of the way into a mix, just to hear, because limiting will change things depending on the limiter that you use. And you may want to make slight balance adjustments to compensate for that. But let me just play you a section into the first main breakdown because I'm just starting to get some basic automation done. So here you can see just a couple of little automation lanes that are making things almost kind of dissolve as they go into that breakdown. So there's 4 bars before the piano comes in, and it's nice to always have a few things hang over, but either feed into some reverb like this Detroit stab at the bottom. That's also in conjunction with filtering. And our funk wire patch has got some top end disappearing from it. And I find this is one of those places where you can go for weeks and weeks just tweaking these kind of automation runs. Great fun. Okay, I've got to say this has turned out really well, and I've actually started to add mastering to it now. First up, I've got this plugin from Eventide called the Omnipressor. Now, it's actually more of an effects-based compressor. I used it all over the F9 Trip Hop pack to crunch all the drums together. But it's really sometimes good at house tracks. It's got a great little punch. I do, though, often bring the mix control down on the compressor so some of the dry signal goes through. Got it here set to about 64 to 66%. And also just one little instance of ozone. It's doing some back-end limiting and a little bit of EQ curve. Might actually just brighten it up a bit. But let me just play you from this piano drop-in so you hear how it's sounding. So really nice and solid there, and every single one of the sounds from this production is from the F9 Origins range. That's the F9 Beats, the F9 Bass Collection, and the brand new F9 Keys and Synths. Now, I have done a couple of little extra things whilst I was mixing here just to help out. For example, I've grouped the strings together for the bit where the drums are in so that I can add some processing over the top. Also grouped some of the pianos together there. And that was actually so I could add a little bit of washy reverb over the back from a Chromaverb, a tiny little bit of overdrive. Even though there's no drive actually set on here, it does add a few little harmonics. This is all to the piano part. And then a nice quick sidechain compressor again. That just tucks it all in when the actual beats are there. So again, just a small amount of grouping just to keep everything under control. Now, one thing I totally forgot with ozone, when you actually come to set the final output controls of the maximizer, if you can, and it's sounding absolutely fine when you do it, always turn this true peak on and also drop the ceiling to about somewhere near minus 0.4 dB. Both of these things will actually stop intersample peaking happening when this goes anywhere near codecs. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, go and look it all up. It's actually quite serious now because obviously streaming is the main distribution for music. And anything that you can do to increase the potential quality of your streaming is a very good thing indeed. And dance music is always pushed. So these two controls can be absolutely vital. Okay, I think the only thing left for me now is to actually play you this down and see what you think. Thank you so much for watching if you've reached this far, and we'll see you next time.